Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor for me to be here, especially to be talking on a day named for Milton Friedman, one of my intellectual heroes. Someone who, as I'm sure many of you know in this room, also spoke beautifully on the issue of free trade. And that's what I will talk today about. Trade today, if you haven't been watching TV or listening to radio ads, as we here in North Carolina are being bombarded by these days, trade is under attack. The candidates like Donald Trump and others have been on the protectionist warpath. And they're attacking not just our trading partners and our trading agreements, but also our country's long-held political consensus in favor of open trade, dating back about 70 years. The demise of this consensus is in one sense really odd. Trade has never been really popular with voters, and modest declines in recent polls are pretty typical for hyper-partisan political election years. But it's no less a real decline. For the first time in decades, both major presidential party candidates are openly skeptical of trade, one outright hostile. And congressional leaders, ones who claim to be free traders even, are unwilling to consider the President Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership, a very large regional trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific. And in a time when our stagnant economy could really use a trade-provided boost, proposals related to free trade are nowhere to be found. You'd be laughed out of Washington, D.C. for trying to bring up some sort of trade liberalization policy right now, even though today's GDP number was about 1%. So how did America and how did our trade policy devolve from the advocacy of JFK, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, both Bushes, and even President Obama today, to the divisive protectionism of Trump and Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and others? Well, first, it's important to understand that trade has always faced inherent political headwinds because protectionism produces concentrated benefits for protected industries and workers and diffuse costs for us consumers. So these factors not only motivate certain industries and workers to intensely lobby for protection from foreign competition, but they also create an environment where Tom Friedman once famously said, the well-intentioned and ill-informed are being led about by the ill-intentioned and well-informed. We see this today. Just at the DNC this week, far more people are intensely riled up about the TPP, some for some pretty kooky reasons, while the rest of us mostly just shrug. It's inevitable that these types of pressures affect our political class and our political discourse. But this has always been the case. And yet the pro-trade consensus survived and even thrived from the 40s through the 90s. Since then, however, it's begun to unravel. Now, some causes for the recent decline, I think, are pretty obvious. As my Cato colleague Dan Eichenson and I documented in 2009, the Democratic Party, once pretty supportive of trade, slowly embraced protectionism. Its platform shifted, and legislative record shifted from trade-friendly in about 1996 to basically mirroring the anti-globalization movement in 2008. The shift is startling. Bill Clinton fought for congressional passage of both the NAFTA and the WTO, securing over 100 Democrats in the process. But today, Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, almost unanimously refuse to support their standard bearer, President Obama's signature trade deal, the TPP. This is just simply not Bill Clinton's party anymore. And President Obama himself deserves some of the blame. He's supporting TPP now, but he successfully campaigned against NAFTA in 2008 and outsourcing in 2012, and that showed other politicians that protectionism on the campaign trail reaps political dividends. The president also condoned or implemented discrete trade restrictions during his early years, like the 2009 safeguard against Chinese tires and a ban on Mexican trucks on US roads, while totally refusing to spend any political capital to advocate trade liberalization policies like completed FTAs with Peru, Colombia, and Panama. Even now, in selling the TPP, President Obama unfortunately emphasizes new rules for labor and the environment and state-owned enterprises, as opposed to the unassailable economic and moral arguments that have supported free trade for centuries. And TPP might actually now be in force instead of languishing in congressional limbo had the president experienced his trade conversion years ago instead of in 2015. But look, those are the obvious reasons. Unfortunately, trade proponents in Washington also help create the current wave of American trade skepticism and hostility. They did this in two ways. First, bad rhetoric, and second, bad policy. On rhetoric, our so-called free traders embraced a mercantilist message to sell trade agreements, a message that touts every deal by noting only its ability to generate exports and trade surpluses. Well, it seems like every quote from a politician or CEO touting the TPP or another trade agreement notes only how it will open new markets for US exports. Now, that's certainly true and good, but it's also highly problematic in terms of a longer-term battle over what free trade really is. It's problematic because mercantilism, and by preaching mercantilism, these groups fuel prevalent protectionist myths about the imports shrinking the US economy and costing jobs, and that the trade balance is some sort of handy scoreboard for gauging US policy. If, per the free trade folks, exports are the only good thing from an FTA, and if they only praise its projected trade surpluses, the unstated flip side is that imports and trade deficits are bad. Two things any legitimate economist, and especially Milton Friedman, would tell you are just flat wrong. At the same time, these free traders fail to attack the prevalent myths I just mentioned, leaving it to nerdy wonks like me with little voice and influence, and yielding the floor to loud protectionists like certain presidential candidates who wrongly blame trade for all of America's ills, including our alleged deindustrialization, we'll talk about that more in a second, and our general economic malaise. Now, Trump's rhetoric, heavy on trade deficit demagoguery and unsupported allegations of pervasive foreign cheating, is actually straight from the dusty old protectionist playbook. Yet it's rarely challenged by timid political rivals. Indeed, I can only count on my one hand the few times during the entire GOP primary that a supposed free market politician actually challenged Trump on trade. And never, ever in a sustained and vocal manner. As such, preposterous claims about trade and jobs are challenged again by us voiceless wonks instead of more powerful groups like elected officials and pundits that might actually affect public perceptions. Combined with the aforementioned mercantilist rhetoric, we see that trade might just be the only issue in which the good guys, the free traders, not only fail to rebut their adversaries their incorrect arguments, but actually concede them. And that's not the recipe for winning policy in the long term. So trade proponents have also erred by consistently over-relying on economic data, particularly forecasts, to push trade liberalization policy. So not only are these data really boring, one of the reasons I'm not doing a PowerPoint today is I don't want to bore you with a bunch of numbers and stats, but they accurately predicting the impact of wide-ranging trade agreements and policies among sovereign nations is an impossible task because trade flows and national economic performance rely on factors that often have little to do with trade policy. Treating statistics as gospel imperils future advocacy efforts whenever these predicted results fail to materialize, and they often inevitably do. In fact, today, US labor unions and other groups discount the United States International Trade Commission's new analysis of the TPP because the same review of the US-Korea FTA a few years ago, inaccurately predicted a shrinking bilateral trade deficit. Now, never mind that Korea's economy actually entered a recession shortly after the FTA took effect, this crippling Korean demand for US exports. None of that matters. On policy, there have been equal failures, this time bipartisan failures. Politicians have not adapted our trade policies, our labor policies, and economic policies to the realities of today's more globalized, more automated, connected world. Our policymakers continue to pursue trade liberalization only through reciprocal FTAs like the TPP, even though these agreements have these rigid tariff schedules and rules of origin that deter optimal sourcing decisions in fields defined by ever-changing global supply chains. Your iPhone, your smartphone is a perfect example. It's designed in America, assembled in China from parts made all over the world, including here, but those parts and suppliers are constantly changing due to various economic and social trends. Our FTAs, however, especially bilateral ones, lock manufacturers into certain arrangements that might not actually make the most economic sense. The result is higher prices and lower quality, and generally a muddled approach to trade. FTAs also can undermine public confidence in trade liberalization by treating the beneficial reduction of domestic trade barriers as a concession to be resisted by US negotiators, and by traditionally keeping negotiations secret, and by promulgating arcane, heavily lobbied rules, for example on pharmaceutical patent protections or investor state disciplines, that give the not wholly unwarranted impression that current US policy nefariously benefits only multinational corporations at the expense of American workers. Now, never mind that the vast majority of an FTA is simply the elimination of current government tariff and non-tariff barriers to free market competition, barriers that have been put in place over decades by heavily lobbied politicians. That is all obfuscated by the technicality and the process involved with a free trade agreement. So at the same time, non-trade domestic policy has not only failed to help workers and companies adjust to disruptive and growing forces like globalization and technology, but likely hinders this adjustment. I wrote in National Review earlier this year that trade has revealed, though not caused, a serious problem in our labor market. And this is a veritable collapse in the willingness or ability of US workers to change jobs or find new ones when disaster strikes. Some of the decline in this labor dynamism, we call it, is natural for an aging workforce. But much of it stems from government policies that deter private savings, discourage risk-taking, and fail to help unemployed workers find new jobs in burgeoning fields. One of my favorite examples is that right now you can get a tax deduction for training in your current job, but you can't get that same deduction for training in a future job. That means that workers that are working in fields that they can see that are dying right in front of them can't actually get help training themselves in a new field, say information technology, and thus, when disaster strikes, they're not ready for taking the next step in their lives. This is an utterly stupid approach to labor policy and labor dynamism. Now, another good example is our Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, something you're probably going to hear a lot about if TPP ever does come up for debate. That program sounds great. It provides assistance for workers adversely affected by trade, but in reality, it is extremely costly and has been found to actually leave participants worse off in terms of future wages and benefits than similarly situated individuals outside of the program. We have dozens of training policies in place, and they all have been proven to be pretty ineffective at helping displaced workers find new work. TAA also, however, breeds the misconception that trade is somehow different from and worse than other forms of creative destruction, like technology or changing consumer tastes. You don't hear about adjustment for the guy who worked at the video store over at Cameron Village, only the guy that worked in a textile mill affected by Chinese competition. That, again, makes no sense. Meanwhile, American companies are hobbled by one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, an ever-growing mountain of overregulation, and winning support for increased global competition under these circumstances is a fool's errand. Other countries, such as Canada, have actually figured this out. They pursue a more logical mix of trade agreements and unilateral market liberalization, so lowering their own barriers regardless of what anybody else does, as well as corporate tax rate reductions and other mechanisms designed to ensure that Canadian workers and manufacturers aren't boxing with one arm tied behind their backs. So this is the depressing landscape we now find ourselves. And it's why the protectionists on trade now seem to be winning the political battle, in my view. So what do trade advocates do? Well, we need to learn from our errors. As I mentioned, we've seen failures both in policy and in rhetoric. So let's start with better policy. We need reforms of labor, tax, and trade laws that reflect the realities of a 21st century global economy. On trade, this means a simpler and more transparent, but broader, not narrower, mix of trade agreements, unilateral reductions in trade barriers that have for years been enriching well-connected cronies at most Americans' expense, and legal reforms that strengthen the ability of all workers and companies, not just those exposed to import competition, to confront inevitable market disruptions and to thrive in the global marketplace. You know, the US government must also be more willing to use legal dispute settlement mechanisms, particularly those at the WTO, and their anti-subsidy rules at the WTO, to ensure that our trading partners are held to account. But this can only be done after getting our own trade and subsidy house in order. You might not know this, but it's currently quite a mess. The reality is the United States provides billions of dollars in corporate subsidies to its own industry and corporations, and meanwhile imposes plenty of protectionist measures on its own, particularly in the form of non-tariff barriers and what we call trade remedy measures that I'll talk about in just a second. But that's the policy side. Policy's tough. Rhetoric is actually pretty easy, and we really need better rhetoric in the area. And this really brings us back to Milton Friedman. So as I've written a few times for Cato, long-term polling from organizations like Gallup and Pew indicate that the opinions of a lot of Americans on trade are loosely held, shaped by partisanship, and capable of shifting in response to improved trade rhetoric. So a good example of this is that in the years leading up to President Obama's tenure, Democrats really didn't like trade. All of a sudden, President Obama gets office, and next thing you know, Democrats do like trade. Meanwhile, Republicans have soured on trade. So there's a significant shift in public opinion that really is to do with more loosely held and malleable opinions. These people are ripe for the taking for a better trade message. So going back to what we know about trade, all of this makes perfect sense. You know, I mentioned concentrated benefits and diffuse costs before. You know, most people don't know or care much about free trade, and they don't know someone hurt by import competition. Polls show under 20% of Americans have a friend or family member who actually lost a job because of trade and imports, or at least they think. So these voters tend to go with the flow based on what they hear from politicians and the media. Now, a new poll out of Texas, one of the most free market, trade-dependent, and economically successful states in the country, actually lays this situation bare. Over half of all Republicans in the state, free market Republicans, having spent the last year listening to an unchallenged Donald Trump rail against bad trade deals, now view them as bad for the US economy, while only 17% of Republicans in Texas see them as a good thing. Clearly, something other than actual economic experience is driving these views. And it again tells us that a better trade message can move the needle. So what does a better trade message look like? Well, first and most simply, trade advocates need to ditch the mercantilism, adopt a message that emphasizes the benefits of exports and imports. over half of everything we import is stuff used by other American manufacturers to make globally competitive products. So lowering domestic trade barriers is a tax cut for these downstream companies and their workers. And these are workers, by the way, who outnumber their upstream counterparts by 10 to 1 or more. It's also undeniable that imports, whether it be snazzy smartphones or cheap roses from the supermarket, one of my favorite free market aspects, make our lives better, and that the vast majority of these consumer benefits accrue to poor and middle class consumers who can stretch their budgets farther because they have just a little bit lower prices. Free traders never seem to mention, at least those in Congress and in the business community, these simple facts. And by ignoring them, like I said, they sow the seeds of their own rhetorical destruction. Second, free traders must be more willing to attack common protectionist myths. As I just mentioned earlier, the protectionism you're hearing on the campaign trail these days is really just the same old shtick that guys like Pat Buchanan have been peddling for decades, revolving around a few well-worn myths about, for example, the supposed death of American manufacturing, the misery of an expanding trade deficit, or pervasive foreign cheating. Each of these arguments, however, is obviously manifestly incorrect. For example, yes, the number of US manufacturing jobs has declined, but that started long before NAFTA and China's entry into the WTO, going back really to the 40s. And it's been going on in almost every country in the world due to productivity gains, things like robots, not trade. This is why manufacturing output in the United States and value add are actually at record highs, while worker earnings are way up. This is what productivity does. American manufacturers today efficiently produce over $2 trillion worth of goods each year. And the United States is the world's second largest manufacturing nation. North Carolina, I looked at the stats right before this event, produced $63 billion worth of manufactured goods in 1997, produces $100 billion today. That's a 58% increase during the time of NAFTA and the World Trade Organization and the WTO. If you look at these numbers closely, what you see is that textiles decline while computers and chemicals go way, way up, reflecting our state's natural evolution, something that trade helps promote. And that many of these manufacturers in our state actually rely on imports. Lenovo, for example, to make computers imports inputs from China to make other products. And they make about $10 billion a year worth of computer products in this state. So the idea that we don't make anything anymore is simply incorrect. We just don't make T-shirts anymore. We make satellites. We make airplanes. Things that you might not see at Walmart or Target, but things that provide much better, much higher paying jobs. The second myth is on the trade deficit. Yes, the trade deficit has expanded in the last few years, but any economist will tell you that trade balances are mainly about national savings and consumption trends, not trade. And they tend to track a country's general economic performance. The US trade deficit is actually matched by the laws of economics, an equal amount of foreign investment. So that's buoyed in part by the dollar's role as a reserve currency. So this is why for the last 30 years, there's actually been a very strong correlation between an expanding US trade deficit and accelerating US GDP growth and accelerating US manufacturing output. So to put this quite simply, as our trade deficit has gone up, concurrently GDP has gone up. Manufacturing output has gone up. That's certainly not to say that the trade deficit caused these things. It's simply to belie the idea that our trade deficit is some sort of harbinger of economic doom. It's just simply not true. Indeed, the last time the US trade deficit actually shrunk significantly was during the Great Recession, a little fact that protectionists rooting for a smaller trade deficit can never quite seem to explain, though they're rarely asked to. And yes, our trading partners occasionally cheat. whether it be through subsidies or intellectual property theft or barriers to U.S. exports. But they don't do it very often, and they certainly don't do it with impunity. In fact, the U.S. unfair trade laws, these trade remedy measures I mentioned earlier, we have these laws in place for domestic companies and workers, and these groups have used them to successfully lobby for over 300 special duties, 100 plus on Chinese-made products, for unfairly traded, dumped, or subsidized imports. Meanwhile, about 95% of all imports are actually enter into the United States under fairly traded conditions, under these same laws. Laws, by the way, which are heavily influenced and biased towards the domestic industry already. The United States has also brought about 100 cases to the dispute settlement body at the WTO, winning almost all of them. And finally, like I said, it's not like US companies themselves don't receive billions of dollars in corporate subsidies themselves. So other myths are out there, for example, on FTAs and American sovereignty, and they're similarly wrong, and they warrant a much stronger pushback. As the election and recent polls make clear, the pro-trade camp's current head-in-the-sand approach really isn't working. So finally, trade advocates need to get back to basics and recognize the logical and moral case for free trade. This is something that Friedman did so well. Sure, he wrote brilliant, egg-heady stuff on economics and trade and free markets, but perhaps his most lasting contribution to trade policy has been a series of lectures and Q&A sessions, now thankfully on YouTube, on the reason and morality of free trade. Whether it was describing the wonder that is voluntary cross-border cooperation to make a surprisingly complex pencil, or simply questioning audience members' assumptions about whether we should welcome or oppose foreigners subsidizing our own consumption. Friedman was a master at making trade simple and revealing the flaws in and immorality of protectionism. Free traders need to get back to this and to talk about trade not as some zero-sum competition between countries, but as voluntary, mutually beneficial cooperation among free individuals. To explain how quotas and tariffs and other barriers to trade are nothing more than government intervention in our daily lives. Intervention that doesn't arrive naturally or by accident, but through lobbying and cronyism. Protectionism results from this intense lobbying by well-connected groups who want to block competition and force us American consumers to subsidize, through higher prices and taxes on imports, their businesses. Free trade, and most aspects of free trade agreements, by contrast, seeks to remove government from the picture, to let Americans transact with whomever they want, however they want, whenever they want. Even worse, these hidden taxes caused by protectionism disproportionately hurt poor consumers who must pay more of their daily budgets for necessities like food and clothing. Americans, especially conservatives and libertarians, seem to get these moral points in most areas of policy, but they forget about them in trade. We recoil at the thought of putting health and human services between us and our doctors, but openly lobby to put the Department of Commerce between us and our merchants. We oppose subsidies to Solyndra or giant agricultural corporations, but celebrate when protectionists succeed in getting the federal government to force poor American consumers to subsidize giant steel and textile corporations. This divergence really needs to change. Protectionists must no longer be given free rein to set the terms of the debate, to claim to speak for the little guy, and to mislead with impunity. If they want to fight, free traders should give them one. We have not just the factual, but also the moral high ground. Now, what's at stake here in close isn't just about trade policy. Friedman once pointed out that interferences with international trade appear innocuous. They can get the support of people who are otherwise apprehensive of interference by government into economic affairs. Many businesses may even regard them as part of the American way of life. Yet there are few interferences which are capable of spreading so far and ultimately being so destructive of free enterprise. In this way, Friedman understood that protectionism is often the gateway drug to other forms of authoritarianism and government intervention. And it's a big reason why I and others fight it. But the fact is that until trade proponents learn from their failures, until we change course both rhetorically and in policy, and once again approach a more Friedman-esque approach to explaining and defending free trade, the Donald Trumps of the world will keep on winning, and they will ensure less freedom and a lower standard of living for us all. Thank you.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.